Here we are, birds in the background, very late autumn. The cat's wandering around. He thinks he's the producer of this video, and he may be, who knows. I think he also does the filming as well as the editing. Very smart cat. By the time you see this video, the election results will have solidified, and most likely the Labor Party will have a majority in its own right, or it will be a minority government of 1 or 2 seats. Most likely it will be a majority in its own right. And now a lot of people are using terms like hope and the dawn of a new, the dawn of a new era. And the reality is, what we've seen is basically a return of a government that has been totally incorporated into the private investment for private profit mantra. Once again, we've seen candidates who've got a more radical agenda challenging that private investment for private profit mantra swept aside. And it happens for a variety of reasons. One, in a parliamentary system you basically need a political party to be effective, or as we've seen with the Teal independents, you need to have at least $1 million in your back pocket to run a good campaign in a House of Representatives seat. So the reality is, little will change. Obviously some issues will be addressed. The Uluru Statement from the Heart will be addressed. Issues about housing don't seem to be addressed, although Mr Albanese makes the point that his mother was on a disability support pension and that he lived in public housing in Sydney. There's nothing in the Labor Party policy to promote a public housing agenda. But what we need to be careful about is not to be negative about possibilities. What the election of a mildly reformist government does, it gives us the opportunity to stretch the envelope, to bring forward those policies which for one reason or another were rejected by the electorate, like universal basic income, increased public housing, the cessation of privatisation, and the list goes on and on. And it's very important in this early period that we don't fall into the trap of supporting those elements in society, the born-to-rule crowd, who threaten by the prospect of some minor reform, will be using every means of their disposal to sabotage the current mild reformist agenda which the Labor Party wants to introduce into Parliament. And that's the key. We will see the Murdoch-dominated media, as we saw before the election. We will see especially the Australian. We will see the One Nation, United Australia Party folk peddling conspiracy theories, peddling disillusionment, peddling despair. Because if we remember what happened to the Rudd-Gillard government, you can actually see whenever there's a reformist government in power, especially one that's not exceptionally reformist, undermining that government is the primary objective of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. That will be their primary objection over the next 3 years. And it will be undermined unless people like us become more involved in direct action. Because what scares or frightens the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication more than a mildly reformist government is a government that is willing to respond to pressure from the streets. For far too long, Australians have been caught up in issue-orientated politics, issue-orientated cultural agendas, social agendas. For far too long, we've allowed the third of Australians living on social security benefits and the working poor, and those that don't own their own homes, their concerns to be shunted aside in preference of issue-orientated politics. Now, obviously there's a place for issue-orientated politics, but the great thing about capitalism, a private investment for private profit model, is it can incorporate almost any issue within its agenda. Marriage equality can be incorporated in a capitalist agenda. Green capitalism, incorporated in a capitalist agenda. And the list goes on and on. Any issue can be incorporated in a capitalist agenda, even the issue of reconciliation between this country's Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, because when you will see this video, it will be most likely sometime during Reconciliation Week, a week which is bordered by National Sorry Day on the 26th of May and Mabo Day on the 3rd of June. But one thing they cannot incorporate into their agenda, one thing a capitalist society, a society based on private investment for private profit, cannot incorporate, is the cry to equalise divisions in society. The cry to ensure that the rich don't get richer and the poor get poorer, as we've been seen over the last 4 decades during the privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation revolution. And if you think that the election of a Labor government is going to put a halt to that, think again. The Whitlam Labor government in the 1970s was able to introduce a raft of reformist legislation because of the activities of people in the street, because of the protests that were being organised, the climate for change which was created, which allowed them to push a reformist agenda until it was the Whitlam-led Labor government was removed from power. So you can see that we need to do 2 things. One, we don't need to be trapped in the cul-de-sac which will be created where the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication and the investment class in the society will do everything they can to destabilise the current government and the current government's agenda. We are entering a difficult period. A period where inflation is an issue, increased interest rates is an issue, the working poor is an issue, the lack of resources for the 1% that rely, for the 1/3 of the population that rely on social security benefits is an issue, housing security is an issue, being able to meet your bills at the end of the week is an issue, and it's going to become an increasingly important issue. So in order to slip back into the politics of division, and that's one thing I must congratulate Mr Albanese on, claiming that his government will reject the politics of division, the them and us mentality, the leaners and the movers, that type of mentality which allowed the robo-debt to be introduced to harass hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on social security benefits, while allowing $18 billion to be going to the pockets of corporations and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic, who are actually making a profit during the pandemic, not a loss, and having a situation where there was no way the government could actually recoup that benefit to the corporate sector. So we are in for a hard time, And the best way to contain that hard time is to be active. Elections are one point in a 3-year cycle federally. Irrespective of who is in government and irrespective of the agendas they pursue, the fact is that in this country we still worship at the altar of Mammon. We continue to be involved in activities on a day-to-day basis which consume us in the struggle to meet our financial commitments. And with easy credit, high housing costs, we are now reaching a situation where the Pied Piper wishes to be paid. And that's a dilemma. Australia has the second highest housing prices in the world. It is one of the highest 3 indebted nations, and I'm talking about the $1 trillion national debt, but I'm talking about personal debt to private banks and private financial institutions, which in some cases have been charging 20% interest on credit cards when they borrow money at less than 0.25%. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. So it's very important that we don't join the sky's going to fall in bandwagon, because there is a mildly reformist Labor government in power, supported by a crossbench of independents and Greens. Some who have a social agenda, some who have a more radical economic agenda. Because the most important thing that will happen over the next 3 years is the constant efforts to belittle the current government's reformist agenda, mildly reformist agenda. And for us to fall into that trap is a mistake. I support any reforms which make people's lives better. And that's what a reform is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a mechanism by which people's lives are made better. Most reforms that have occurred in the past 40 years have actually made life for the general public worse. Unfortunately, because of the never-ending cycle of propaganda masquerading as news commentary and analysis in this country, we seem to go round and round and round, continually making the same mistakes, more importantly, not being able to address the issues that need to be addressed, major issues that need to be addressed. Now, it is a brand new day. It can be a brand new day. It can be the beginning of a radical reform agenda. Not because the Labor Party wants to pursue a radical reformist agenda, or the Greens or the crossbenchers, but because they're forced to pursue that agenda to maintain their political credibility. Because ultimately, what people want is the ability to live lives free of financial coercion and financial pressure. The ability to look after their families and friends, the ability to live in peace and security. There's one lesson to be drawn from this election. It's the lesson that those electors of Chinese descent have sent to the Liberal National Party in seat after seat which has changed hands, where there is a significant Chinese population in that seat. People do not want this belligerent, warlike attitude when it comes to China. We don't want to become the Ukraine of the South Pacific. We don't want to be part of some proxy war to protect the United States' interests in the Northern Hemisphere. We are an independent, sovereign nation state, which should have our own defence policies, which accommodate the situation we find around us. That is the key. That is the key to change. And for us to allow the Murdoch empire and the other corporate-owned media outlets and social media to drive us into a rabbit warren of conspiracy theories, hatreds, divisions based on sexual orientation, race, religion, language spoken, nationality, is the last thing that we need to do. While the Pauline Hansons and the One Nation, the Clive Palmers of the world drive people who find themselves excluded from the political process in that direction, we need to be able to reach out to these people and point out the issues they face are not because of the other in our community, but because wealth and power continues to be concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people in the society. And to allow us to be part of that carping, complaining, consumer element in this society, to be part of that efforts to sabotage even mildly reformist agenda from the current Albanese-led Labor government falls into the trap. Because we want a more radical agenda does not mean we shouldn't support the mildly reformist agenda of the Albanese-led Labor government. But what it means is we need to be able to take our struggle out back into the streets, something that hasn't happened now for decades. Because people have been so caught up in the social media bubble, they think by pressing a button that somehow things will change. And I think what this election has demonstrated is change does not come from nowhere. It comes from pressure. Minimal change comes from minimal pressure. If you're interested in following these ideas, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. You can join via the net. Go to pibci.net. The sooner we increase our membership, the sooner we'll be able to participate as a political party in federal elections. Because one thing which this federal election has highlighted to me as I stood as an independent Senate candidate below the line, the fact is that without a political party behind you, without extensive financial support, the chances of ever being elected and changing that agenda are minuscule.